This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Support for this podcast and the following messages come from our friends at the Paul Mueller Company and Hopsteiner. Please thank them. This podcast wouldn't be possible without their generous support.
Paul Mueller Company has been manufacturing quality brewing equipment since 1964. Our innovative design and engineering will save you time, labor, and ingredients, sending money back to your bottom line. Learn more about our new mobile hop module at paulmueller.com. This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
The disease has moved out of Africa. It's now into the Middle East, and so it's only a matter of time before it arrives. So we're trying to develop resistant varieties and just have them out there. So when this fungus does arrive, it won't, as I say, clean our clock.
Brewing is a continuation of the malting process, which is dependent on the life cycle of the barley plant. If you want to really understand brewing, you've got to understand malting. But also realize that the entire malting industry relies on the efforts of a handful of people like Pat.
Hi, my name is Pat Hayes. I'm with Oregon State University, and I work with the Oregon Barley Project.
Pat, most barley varieties are pure lines, meaning they'll be the same next year and indefinitely. Explain that to listeners.
Yeah, so a barley flower has both male and female reproductive organs, and so it is going to self-pollinate. And that means that with every cycle of self-pollination that you reduce the percentage of heterozygosity by 50%. So let me give you a concrete example. We cross Golden Promise by Full Pint, and that first generation, which would be the F1 or the hybrid generation, that one will be 100% heterozygous at every locus where Golden Promise and Full Pint differ.
Barley breeding is a public endeavor in North America. You, for example, work for Oregon State University, but breeding is privatized in the rest of the world. Why is that?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, I think, for the fact that we still see public sector engagement in plant breeding in the United States with barley and wheat, most notably. And you see private sector engagement elsewhere. It's really sort of an evolutionary kind of a process. If you look at Europe, where there is almost exclusively private sector barley, that system really kind of kicked in after the Second World War, where you had research institutes dedicating themselves to kind of pure science, and then you had the private sector as the developer and the outlet for products. Here in the U.S., we saw a similar trend with hybrid crops. And so if you take corn, for example, there very little public sector involvement in developing hybrid corn varieties. That's almost exclusively private sector. Soybeans are self-pollinated, and we saw them go from the public to the private sector. And in the U.S. now, there's actually increasing engagement of the private sector in barley. For example, domestically, AB InBev and Coors have their own breeding programs. And then we're seeing an increasing presence of barley varieties from European companies such as Ackerman and Lima Grain cereal seeds. So we may be at sort of a kind of a tipping point, if you will, in the U.S., where we still have very viable, active public programs, but we also have very effective private sector programs. So far, there's excellent collaboration between all of those in the U.S.
Is there an advantage one way or another? Does barley breeding suffer in the U.S. without a bunch of private funds behind your efforts?
Well, obviously we'd probably, I could say blithely that we would do better if we had more funding. And at this point in time, we do have significant private sector support for our program via the American Malt Barley Association, for example, Great Western Malting, Mecca Great Estate Malting. So different private entities put money into our research program. And so, down the road, 10, 20 years from now, the question would be, are those entities still going to be supporting a private sector program, or will there be new relationships that are established between, say, malting and brewing companies and the private sector? That just kind of remains to be seen.
Probably every brewer understands that barley breeding is a 10 to 15 year process, but I bet most of them couldn't tell you why that is. Walk us through all the steps along that path to commercial acceptance.
Right. So it is definitely a situation where you have to take the long view. Let's harken back to that example that we had at the outset here of crossing Golden Promise by Full Pint, for example. And so I said, hey, we got this F1 generation. It's 100% heterozygosity. That would be F1 hybrid seed. And so if we were in the corn business or the hybrid tomato business, that's what would be marketed. And barley does show some hybrid vigor, otherwise known as heterosis at the F1 generation. But for a number of reasons, F1 hybrids don't really fit the malting barley picture at this point. And so what you have to do is go through various cycles of self-pollination until you're at, say, the F7. That would be 7 or 8 generations after making the initial cross, before you are sufficiently homozygous or sufficiently pure, if you will, where you can start to have confidence in the performance of potential varieties at both the agronomic and the malting quality level. There's a couple of ways to kind of speed that up a little bit, so you can engage in off-season nurseries, they're called. So, for example, I might have my F1 in Oregon and do my F2 generation in Chile, and then bring that back to Oregon for the F3 generation. And thus I can compress the breeding cycles. I can also compress the breeding cycles through what's called double haploid breeding, and we may go into that in a little more detail. But it's just it's a way of going from the F1 generation to complete homozygosity in one leap. But once you're at that completely homozygous stage, you've really only begun the process of thorough vetting of the potential variety for its agronomic and malting quality characters. The American Malt Barley Association, Malting Barley Association, I should say, has, for example, a very defined series of steps that a variety goes through before it gets to final approval. And that is a multi-year process that's designed to give farmers, maltsters, and brewers confidence that the selection is indeed going to perform as expected.
Could you get into a little bit more detail about crossing? What is, on a practical level, what does that actually look like for you? How does that process work?
Look like is definitely a good way to put it. With deteriorating eyesight, then increasing magnification becomes necessary. So if I look into a barley floret, I need like at least 2 X's at this point of reading glasses to see what's happening down in there. So if you imagine a barley spike, or head as we'd call it, then each of the flowers is what's called a floret. And what you need to do is you need to emasculate that, each of those florets, in order to turn it into a female. Because as we discussed at the outset, the barley flower is what's called a perfect flower. And so it has male and female reproductive organs. So you take a pair of scissors and you cut across that floret, which is about the size of a pencil eraser, more or less. So you cut across that thing, and then you need to go in with a pair of tweezers and pull out the male reproductive organs, which are called the anthers. And there's 3 of them in there. And each of those anthers is about the size of, half of a chopstick in width and maybe, one knuckle, half a knuckle in terms of length. And you need to pull those things out completely because each anther within it has thousands, tens of thousands of pollen grains. And so you need to get everything out of there at the right point in time. You then leave that floret for about 3 days until the stigma, which is the female piece of the anatomy there, becomes receptive, and then you bring in the pollen from the male donor.
What are the most challenging parts of the whole breeding process for the breeder?
I would say that it's having to throw away things, and that's what plant breeding is, just sort of about being ruthless, that you've gone to all the work to create these F2s or F3 segregating generation material or these double haploids, but you can't keep them all. And so you need to just be ruthless in your selection process. And even when you have a potential selection out there that is really outstanding for one attribute or another, then you still can't keep it. It's got to be outstanding for all attributes.
Yep, you've probably thrown away the next greatest barley variety hundreds of times, right? Maybe thousands of times, maybe millions of times.
Absolutely. So that's kind of what, that you're just always in the back of your mind. And then you want to say, well, let's sort of keep one of these things around. My wife just dropped by and she's headed off here to a class and just made a little note to me on a pad of paper that says it's a numbers game. And that's something that is drilled into us as plant breeders in training, that the more numbers you have out there, the more likely you are to get the final combination of things that you want. So we try all sorts of tricks to maximize the odds of picking that winning variety, and that's sort of where contemporary genetic tools come in.
That's great. Well, I wanted to talk about some of those tricks, and I'm sure you field a lot of questions about genetic tools. Before we get into topics like GMOs and CRISPR, talk about how DNA fingerprinting helps your cause and to what extent you're able to utilize that tool.
Right. So DNA fingerprinting is kind of like the 23andMe of plants. In the case of barley, it would be 7 in me, if you will, because you have 7 pairs of chromosomes out there. So we're fortunate now to have heaps of what are called molecular markers or mileposts along each one of the chromosomes that can generate a DNA fingerprint or a barcode on a selection. So currently, for example, we use something called the Illumina 50K chip. So every selection that we submit then has 50,000 different DNA polymorphisms run on it. And at any given selection, probably maybe a half of those will actually be informative, but still that's 25,000 data points that you've got on things. So some of those data points are actually genes that we know and care about, and then others are linked to genes that we know and care about. And so it is a very useful and informative exercise to have that kind of information, just to know the genetic architecture of each potential selection. We may often be able to go in and say, a given individual has the form of a gene that we want, and therefore we'll keep it based on the 50K, or it has what we don't want, and then you eliminate it. So that's called marker-assisted selection. We found over the years that in addition to the actual selection piece, perhaps what's of the greatest value to us is really understanding the things that we have created. Let me give you an example. We're currently working on resistance to a type of stem rust. So that's a fungus that can affect barley. And this particular fungus strain is called UG99, or the Uganda 99 form. And the reason we're working on this is because we don't have it in the U.S. yet. And it really can just clean the clock of a barley crop If it's infected, the disease has moved out of Africa. It's now into the Middle East, and so it's only a matter of time before it arrives. So we're trying to develop resistant varieties and just have them out there. So when this fungus does arrive, it won't, as I say, clean our clock. So there is a resistance gene identified that confers resistance to this particular strain, and we have a molecular marker for it. We crossed various varieties with donors of that resistance gene, put them through this DNA analysis profiling just to make sure that we really did have the resistance gene there. And lo and behold, we discover that the resistance gene that we knew about is effective about half the time. That in fact, you need other factors, which were kind of undiscovered or not really described, that are needed in order to actually get that full level of expression of resistance. So if we had relied on the molecular marker for the single resistance gene alone, we would have been correct in selecting resistance half the time. So we really need to engage in that continual discovery process, and that's where molecular marker tools are so effective.
I was out, I don't know what year it was, maybe 5 or so years ago at the North Dakota State Barley Field School that Rich Horsley and Paul Schwartz put on. At the time I was there, they were actually building, I can't remember if it was a bio-level safety 2 or 3 lab there, to bring over that stem rust so they could use it there in that facility. Do you have a facility like that at OSU, or do you have to, when you go to test the line that you think has resistance, do you test it here in the U.S., or do you ship it over to where the disease is and put it up against it there?
Well, we try to do all of the above. So we work extensively with Brian Stephenson at University of Minnesota, where they have one of these biocontainment facilities. And so he's a pathologist specialist in these rusts. And so there's a whole just phenomenal skill set that's required to effectively inoculate and then assess the level of disease on seedlings in these biocontainment facilities, because there's limited space in there is what they can actually be testing. And so generally those tests are conducted on plants that only have a couple of leaves. So in plant resistance breeding, then we want to be sure that the resistance is effective at the adult plant stage. And so the place you want to do that then is in the presence of natural infection and at a stage that's going to matter. And the only way that we can do that is to get our material to Africa. And thankfully, the USDA ARS conducts a series of experiments every year throughout Africa in order to allow us to test things. Now, they can only accommodate a certain number of selections in those trials because every breeder is wanting to test material there. So we kind of go through the seedling work through first with Brian, understand what's happening there, and then send a very limited subset of potential resistant sources and then the appropriate susceptible and resistant checks to Africa for confirmation.
Coming up,
climate change is certainly making our life more challenging because, say, formerly when we had a somewhat more stable set of climatic conditions, we kind of knew what diseases to expect. Now all bets are off.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Southern California meets at Three Weavers Brewing April 12th. District Carolinas meets at Holy City April 14th. The Master Brewers Brewery Packaging Course begins April 15th in Madison. District St. Louis meets April 19th at Four Hands Brewery. The 57th District Caribbean Convention is April 19th to 22nd in St. Lucia. Don't miss the Draft Beer Basics and How Gases Affect Beer webinar April 23rd. District St. Paul Minneapolis meets May 10th. Need to build a food safety program for your brewery? Not sure what's required by law? Register for the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points course May 10th in Philly. District Philly meets at the New Yards Brewery the following day, May 11th. District Northwest meets in beautiful Hood River the weekend of May 18th. And District Rocky Mountain holds its Technical Summit in Fort Collins May 19th. View the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. As we've already alluded, one of the main objectives of barley breeding is to outrun the never-ending pursuit of disease. During your career, has it felt like breeding has lost or gained ground in that race against disease?
Well, it's, so that whole race is sometimes referred to as the, Red Queen hypothesis out of Alice in Wonderland. And it's just like the faster you run, the more you stay still. So it's a constant process. And kind of hearkening back to that earlier discussion of how many, potential next best varieties have we thrown out. It's really heartbreaking when you have a selection that you're really excited about, and then some new strain, new form, new something comes up, entirely new disease, and then just takes it out. And so you have to just set it aside. We say that things like that they go into being good parents. And so, it turns out that a favored selection turns out to be susceptible to something. We've seen leaf rust, for example, emerge as a major problem for us. For years, we never even worried about leaf rust. And then it showed up, and some really nice varieties and potential varieties we had were susceptible. And so you say, well, we can't continue those as varieties, but we can cross them to other things that do have resistance to leaf rust, for example, and then select for resistant progeny. So climate change is certainly making our life more challenging because, say, formerly when we had a somewhat more stable set of climatic conditions, we kind of knew what diseases to expect. Now all bets are off. It seems that every year with the greater volatility that then we have new things showing up each year, and then they won't show up for a couple of years.
And then sometimes we just get lucky, right? You want to tell the story of the variety Kindred?
Ooh, I don't know that one in detail.
Okay, well, that's one of the North Dakota varieties that I forget what disease came along and wiped out the entire crop. I think this was in the 40s.
Yeah,
there was just this one barley plant left that had resistance, and it was a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, I would surmise that was probably RPG1 and stem rust, because the same stem rust, but different strains of it have been, afflict wheat and barley throughout the Midwest. And this RPG1 has remained effective against the races of stem rust that we have since the 40s. So hence I'm thinking that Kindred might tie back to that stem rust story, but you want to confirm that.
Yeah, okay. Well, hey, going back to the DNA fingerprinting, I'm curious if you wish you could do more with that. Is there a cost roadblock there, or do you feel that tool is being utilized, as much as we could right now?
Oh, there's certainly a cost roadblock in the sense that we call that genotyping, that step of getting molecular markers. So we budget that into our grants, and so we are typically constrained by how much genotyping we can actually engage in based on how much grant funding we have. So we've been fortunate in the barley community to have had a couple of these big federal grants called CAP grants that have allowed us to pretty much get as much genotyping as we need. There's an outstanding sort of backstop or second level of access built into that, which through what are called the regional genotyping labs. And so these are USDA facilities that are funded specifically to provide genotyping services to wheat and barley. So until now, we've worked with North Dakota State University on this it's called Illumina genotyping, and so the one where we currently have the 50K. So we pay for the reagents to run the 50K, but then they provide the expertise and they have all the equipment and so forth to do that. So it's kind of like at cost to get that genotyping service. We're currently working with our local genotyping lab at Washington State University with Devin C. to develop what would basically be a free genotyping service on a more limited set of markers, but that has been carefully selected to be informative. And so that is something that we'd be able to routinely apply to our breeding program.
And I would imagine, are all these different public breeding programs actively sharing this genetic mapping with each other? I would think that they would.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you take the example of the CAP projects, all the data that were generated through those projects went to something called the T3 database that's organized and managed out of Cornell University. So all of that genotype data is available to anyone, public or private sector. And then, for example, with this Washington State University platform that we're working on, Jamie Sherman at Montana State University and our group chose the initial markers to go on that. And then we worked with Devin, and then Jamie's got a student who's going to identify more markers so that we have a more robust platform. So our community, thankfully, is very open and collaborative.
That's great. We're about to produce an episode on the topic of brewer's yeast modified by CRISPR to produce hop flavor and aroma compounds. You may have seen this in the news recently. About a year ago, you didn't think that CRISPR would be used in public barley breeding programs. Does that still hold true, or has anything changed?
Well, I'd say that CRISPR will probably not be used in public breeding programs to develop finished varieties, just because of the cost of the intellectual property that's likely to be associated with that. And however, as a research tool, it could be absolutely outstanding. And if you come up with a particular validated phenotype that you've accomplished through CRISPR, you could ask the question and say, hey, if I had this particular attribute in there, would that variety be worth $350 a ton, or $375, or $400, or whatever it's going to take to pay the royalties to cover those IP costs that are related to the CRISPR technology?
I've noticed many of the breeding programs here in the U.S. have devoted more resources to winter barley breeding over the last decade. Could you comment on that shift, as well as how the priorities of your own program have shifted over the years?
Yeah, so the shift to winter barley, I think, is a reflection of climate change and an acceptance that this is real, that it's something that we need to be concerned about, and it's also a reflection of changing cropping system patterns, some of which, again, tie back to climate change issues. But barley is a crop that is always going to be challenged in terms of price. We're currently seeing a situation where we have a relatively stable U.S. barley acreage. Most of that barley is destined for malting uses, and most of it is grown under contract. And so, kind of hearkening back to the CRISPR question, whoever is contracting that barley is going to have to be willing to pay an additional premium to whatever intellectual property is associated. So there's always this push to drive down costs, to get out of competitive relationships with corn or soybeans or other crops that growers might have as alternatives to barley in their environment. So fall planted barley is in concept going to be able to take better advantage of available precipitation. It's going to prevent soil loss through erosion and potentially ameliorate some of that fertility runoff and contamination that we see when you do not have ground cover over the winter. So those are all some sort of, what would you say, ecosystem services of a fall planted barley. In general, we see a yield advantage of, say, around 20% in most cases if the fall planted crop survives the winter as compared to a spring crop at the same location. So that's kind of intuitively appealing, because if you get the seed out there in the fall, that plant germinates, establishes a root system, and can just take off and get going. So, for example, right here in the Willamette Valley now, our fall planted material already has multiple leaves out, and some of it is starting to think about transitioning to a reproductive stage, and we haven't even planted our spring crops yet because the soil is too wet for it to work the ground. There's another little twist on the winter barley bit that I'd like to interject at this point, and it's something called facultative growth habit. And the facultative growth habit is one where you have cold tolerance, or the potential to trigger maximum cold tolerance, but you do not require vernalization. And vernalization is the situation where you need a certain number of cold units in order to trigger the vegetative to reproductive transition. So all this that matters, because a facultative variety could be planted in the fall or the spring. So you'd be able to have greater flexibility in terms of what your planting and or market conditions were like in the fall, might drive you for that planting. And if those conditions are not favorable, then you could use the same variety and put that out in the spring application.
I'm glad you brought that up. You don't hear people talk about facultative barley a lot. They usually talk about winter versus spring or summer barley. Are there facultative varieties that people just refer to as winter barleys instead, or is facultative a newer phenomenon in terms of barley varieties? We just don't have many of them bred, or what's the story there?
Yeah, there's not a lot of commercial facultative barley out there at this point. We had one a number of years ago, a 6-row called Maha, M-A-J-A, and it was an example of a true facultative that performed well under fall-seeded conditions, performed well under spring-seeded conditions. It had the sort of two strikes against it. One, it was a 6-row, and it came out just at that sort of moment when the industry shifted to 2-row. And then the other strike against it is it turned out to be very susceptible to leaf rust, that disease that we mentioned a little bit earlier, that we really hadn't anticipated as being a problem. So 2 reasons why Maha is not grown. So we push facultative growth habit in our breeding program. And of the selections that we currently are looking at for the AMBA pilot program, so that's the one that precedes the plant scale program, we have 3 facultatives in that trial at this point. It does mean that a breeding program has to kind of do really twice as much work, if you will, because you want to test your facultative under fall planted conditions, and then you want to test it under spring planted conditions.
For you to breed a facultative barley, are you having to cross a winter with a spring, or is that not how that works?
Yeah, so at some point you have to provide use a parent in the crossing program that provides the non-vernalization allele. So the lack of vernalization requirement can be achieved based on a naturally occurring deletion of 3 genes on chromosome 4H in barley. It's called the VERN2 locus, and there's just a naturally occurring variant where those genes are just dead gone. They're not there. So once you get that into your breeding material, then you can actively select for that deletion. If we look at the lines that I mentioned earlier that are in the AMBA program, we have, for example, full pint by Violetta. So full pint's a spring crossed by Violetta. We selected for Violetta levels of cold tolerance with the full pint lack of vernalization sensitivity. If you don't select for the lack of vernalization sensitivity, you, of course, can recover a winter type. So we have a Maris Otter by full pint cross that's a winter. And so in that particular cross, rather than getting the absence of vernalization from full pint, we picked up the requirement for vernalization from Maris Otter. As once you move forward, then we'd like to get to a situation in our program where everything we had was facultative rather than winter, because it really facilitates a lot of other breeding steps. But it's going to take a while to get to that point, and certainly we're not going to throw away winters in the process.
That's interesting. I'm down here in Virginia, and Violetta is kind of a hot new thing around here. So I'm getting ready to brew some beer with that for the first time.
Cool.
Okay, you've also been doing more and more breeding for naked or hulless barley. Why is that?
Yeah, so the naked work is just got a big boost here recently with a grant that we received from the USDA Competitive Grants Program that's directed at organic farming systems. And so we have a project there that's called multi-use barley for organic systems, and one of those uses is for malting and brewing. The concept of the driver there is, nothing new. People have been eating naked barleys for the last 8,000 years. There's a lot of work in Canada in the late 80s, all through the 90s on naked barleys for multiple uses. And so we're just kind of picking up that baton and trying to carry it on forward here. The idea is that if you didn't have the hull, then the same variety would be potentially useful for malting and brewing, for food, or for feed. let's take the example of a covered barley right now. If your Violetta in Virginia hits 14% protein, your maltster's not going to want to deal with it. You're not going to want to brew with it. And so what options are left for the grower? Feed, and feed generally sells for a loss. So what we'd like to do is give the grower and the other people in the value chain greater opportunity. So let's say you had a naked barley out there, and you comes in at 10 or 11%, brilliant. That feeds into your malt channel, but you hit 13 or 14%. Fine, goes right off to your food channel, doesn't require pearling, or can go directly into the animal feed channels as well. So I really, think at this point in time that we should be looking at naked barleys, and potentially after 8,000 years, just saying thank you, Hull, but your time has come.
All right. Some folks like to say that malt is the new hops, meaning craft brewers are beginning to pay more attention to the influence that barley variety and the malting process has on their beers. I'm curious what you think about the rise of the craft maltster and where all this is headed.
Well, it's certainly, just a symphony to my ears to hear that barley could be the next hops. And so, barley is this essential base of beer, and yet it's always been kind of a situation where, just like barley, behave yourself, just be back there, kind of going while the rest of the band, goes ahead and does their thing, either in terms of hop aroma and flavor or yeast aroma and flavor. And so that's been an area of research that we've picked up in the last couple of years. And it started out with the Flavor Pack, and then the Brewers Association has come on to help us research that. So I do think that barley is going to emerge as a contributor to beer flavor. Certainly that's going to be manifested in certain styles of beer more than in others, at least initially. And that's going to be sort of on the paler end of the spectrum. And the contributions are likely to be subtle and the sorts of things that brewers are going to say, yeah, this matters to me. So I think it's going to be, analogous to a situation that we see now with, say, Maris Otter or Golden Promise, where you have some iconic varieties that brewers still use because they can pick up a flavor or a contribution to mouthfeel or aroma or whatever it is from those malts in their beers, and they're willing to pay that additional premium for them. So does their consumer also pick up that same note? It might be almost an unconscious preference on the part of the consumer initially until they educate themselves and come forward. So we're at kind of an exciting juncture in that research right now. We have had two papers just out in the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists based on Dustin Herb's PhD thesis work, where we showed that indeed the barley variety and the growing environment can contribute significantly to the flavor of beer. The caveat to that research is that those flavors were detected by a trained sensory panel in nano beers. So those were single bottles of beer brewed from a single micro malt. And we've carried that experiment to the next level. And we're now, we're sort of on the edge of finding out, do these flavor differences carry on to the pilot level? And so in collaboration with Deschutes Brewery here in Oregon, with Veronica Vega, who's their research brewer, and then Amanda Benson, who's their sensory specialist, Veronica brewed 2 barrels, each of 5 varieties that were malted by Scott Fisk here in our Barley World Malt House. And those beers are finished, and they've been sent out to trained sensory panels. Deschutes has a panel. Firestone Walker has a panel. New Glarus, RAR Malting, and then at OSU. And so those 5 beers, 2 reps each. We've got 3 Oregon Promise selections, and so those are the potential novel contributors to flavor compared to Full Pint and compared to Copeland. And so the jury is out, and the verdict should be delivered, by end of this month.
If you'd like to learn more about barley breeding, I encourage you to make your way on over to mbaa.com and type Haze into the search bar. That'll get you to a webinar called Breeding Better Barley that Pat put on about a year ago. It's totally free for Master Brewers members who can watch Pat's webinar on demand, along with all the other Master Brewers webinars since 2014. "130 years ago, Master Brewers was built on the concept of brewers helping each other out so we could all make the best possible beer. That's still true to this day, and it's where a lot of the camaraderie in this industry originated. Master Brewers' award-winning Ask the Brewmasters is the best place to go for troubleshooting, where you'll find the industry's only discussion forum that's moderated for technical accuracy by a team of experts. See what everyone else is talking about at community.mbaa.com. Did you enjoy today's episode? Would you like us to keep making more? If so, there's a really simple way you can let us know. Subscribe, rate, and review the Master Brewers Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
When I'm heading out to any other place, my fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much.